Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. Ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friend. Let's see who it is today. Oh. I forgot to record the spinning because I'm a genius. Our winner is Redhead. So Redhead by nature says amateur comedian on real life circumstances. Look, my house is a zoo. If you can fit in, you are truly an animal. Whoops, that is not what I meant to do. Oops, that's not. Sorry about that. I'm a genius today. So we've got some loggy styles. We've got dog and animal and family. Shorts, lives. So it looks like they does some gaming. But then I was looking at the regular videos and I was like, oh, maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, check her out. Like, share, comment, and have a good day. All right, Mr. Bud's going to tell us something interesting. What are you going to tell us, Mr. Bud?
Well, interestingly enough, we have an anniversary of 80 years. On this date, back in 1943, an event happened during World War II, known as the Operation Chastise, or the Dambusters. Now, the story behind it is that before World War II, the British Air Ministry had identified several specific targets that would be strategic importance. Namely in Germany, the Ruhr Valley, due to its dams that were providing hydroelectric power and pure water for steelmaking, drinking water, and water for the canal transports. Well, the problem with it is that the RAF Bomber Command didn't really have the accuracy with large bombs that they needed to be effective. So, making a single strike would be really difficult. A one-off surprise attack might succeed, but at that time, the RAF pretty much lacked a weapon suitable. Mostly, their bombs were just open the bomb bay door and let 20 to 30 of them drop. Well, the concept that they had come up with was designed by a fellow known as Barn Wallace, an assistant chief designer at Vickers. Wallace had worked with the Vickers Wesley and the Vickers Wellington bombers, and while working on the Vickers Windsor, he had begun work with Admiralty support on an anti-shipping bomb, although dam destruction was soon considered. At first, he wanted to drop a 10-long-ton bomb from an altitude of about 40,000 feet as part of a earthquake bomb concept. No bomber aircraft was capable of flying at such an altitude or one carrying such a heavy bomb, and Wallace proposed the 6-injury Victory bomber for this purpose, but it was rejected. Wallace realized that a much smaller explosive charge would suffice if it was able to be exploited against the dam wall itself, under the water, but German reservoir dams were protected with heavy torpedo nets to prevent an explosive device from traveling through the water. Well, Wallace devised a 9,000-pound bomb, more accurately a mine, in the shape of a cylinder, kind of like a depth charge. Armed with a hydrostatic fuse, it was designed to be given a backspin of 500 RPMs. Now, dropped at 60 feet and 240 miles an hour from a release point, the mine would skip across the surface of the water, kind of like skipping a stone, would hit the dam, and then roll down. Now, initially, the backspin was intended to increase the range of the mine, but later it was realized that it would cause the mine, after submerging, to run down the side of the dam base, thus maximizing that explosive effect. The weapon was codenamed Upkeep. Now, testing of this concept included blowing up a scale model dam at the building a research establishment in Watford on May 1942, and then breaching of the disused Nantwia Grow Dam in Wales in July. Subsequent tests suggested that a charge of 7,500 pounds exploded 30 feet under the water would breach a full-size dam. Crucially, this weight also was within the carrying capacity of the Airvo Lancaster, one of my favorite bombers. The first airdrop trials were at Chesil Beach in December 1942, and they used a spinning 4-foot 6-inch sphere dropped from a modified Vickers Wellington. The same aircraft was used until April of 1943, when the first modified Lancasters became available. The testing continued at Chesil Beach and Vancouver, often unsuccessfully, using revised designs of the mine and variations of speed and height. Well, Airvo chief designer Roy Chadwick adapted the Lancaster to carry the mine. To reduce weight, much of its internal armor was removed, as was the mid-dorsal gun turret. The dimensions of the mine and its unusual shape meant that the bomb bay doors had to be removed, and the bomb hung partly below the fuselage. Now, it was mounted on 2 crutches, and before dropping, it was spun by an auxiliary motor. Now, Chadwick worked out the design and installation controls for the gear and the carriage, and the release of the mine in conjunction with Barnes Wallis. The Airvo Lancaster B Mark IIIs were so modified were known as Lancaster B Mark III Specials. Now, in February of 1943, the Air Vice Marshal Francis Linnell at the Ministry of Aircraft Production throughout the work was diverting Wallis from the development of the Vickers-Windsor bomber, which did not become operational. Pressure from Linnell via the chairman of Vickers, Sir Charles Worthington Craven, caused Wallis the offer to resign. Sir Arthur Harris, head of the Bomber Command, after a briefing by Linnell, also opposed the allocation of his bombers. Harris was about to start strategic bombing campaigns against Germany, and Lancasters were just entering service. Wallis had written an influential intelligence officer, Group Captain Frederick Winterbotham, who ensured that the Chief of the Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal Charles Portal, head of the project. Portal saw the film of the Chesil Beach trials, and he was convinced. On February the 26th, 1943, Portal overruled Harris and ordered that 30 Lancasters were to be allocated for the mission target, and the target date was set for May, when water levels would be at their highest and the breaches of the dam would cause most damage. With about 8 weeks to go, the larger upkeep mine that was needed for the mission and the modifications to the Lancasters had yet been designed. Well, the operation was given to No. 5 Group RAF, which formed a new squadron to undertake the dam's mission. It was initially called Squadron X, as the speed of the formation outstripped the RAF process for naming squadrons. Led by 24-year-old Wing Commander Guy Gibson, a veteran of more than 170 bombing and night fighter missions, 21 bomber crews were selected from 5 Group. The crews included RAF personnel of several nationalities, members of the Royal Australian Air Force, Royal Canadian Air Force, and the Royal New Zealand Air Force. The squadron was based at RAF Scrampton, about 5 miles north of Lincoln. Now, the target selected was the Mona Dam and the Sorp Dam upstream in the rural industrial area, with the Eder Dam on the Eder River, which feeds into the Weser, a secondary target. The loss of hydroelectric power was important, but the loss of water to industry, cities, and canals would have greater effect, and there was a potential for devastating flooding if the dams broke. Well, bombing from the altitude of 60 feet at an airspeed of 240 miles an hour and the set distance from the target called for expert crews. Intensive nighttime and low-altitude training began. There was also technical problems to solve. The first one would be to determine when the aircraft was at its optimum distance from the target. The Mona and Eder dams both had towers at each end. A special targeting device with 2 prongs, making the same angle as the 2 towers to show the correct distance from the dam, showed when to release the bomb. Now, BBC documentary, Dambusters Declassified in 2010, stated that the pronged device was not used owing to problems related to vibration, that other methods were employed, including a length of string tied in a loop and pulled back centrally to a fixed point in the manner of a catapult. Now, the second problem was determining the aircraft's altitude, as barometric altimeters lacked accuracy. Well, They solved this, interestingly enough, using two spotlights. What they would do is they would aim one spotlight straight down and one at an angle, and when they both converged on the surface of the water, they were exactly at 60 feet. The crews practiced at the Idebrook Reservoir near Uppingham, Rutland, Aberton Reservoir near Colchester, the Went Reservoir in the Derbyshire Peak District, and Fleet Lagoon at Chesil Beach. Wallace's bombs were first tested at the Land Valley Reservoirs. The squadron took delivery of the bombs on May 13th, and after the final tests on April 29th. At 8:15 on May 15th, at a meeting at Whitworth's house, Gibson and Wallace briefed the squadron's two flight commanders, Squadron Leader Henry Malsey and Squadron Leader H.M. Dingy Young, Gibson's deputy for the Monet attack, Flight Leader John V. Hopgood, and the Squadron Bombing Leader, Flight Lieutenant Bob Hay. The rest of the crews were told in a series of briefings the following day, which began with the briefing of pilots, navigators, and bomb aimers about midday. Formation 1 was comprised of 9 aircraft in 3 groups, listed by the pilot Gibson, Hopgood, and Flight Lieutenant B. Mickey Martin, an Australian serving in the RAF, Young, Flight Lieutenant David Maltby, and Flight Leader David Shannon of the Royal Australian Air Force, and Malsey, Flight Leader Bill Estelle, and Pilot Officer Les Knight of the Royal Australian Air Force. Its mission was to attack the Moan. Any aircraft with bombs remaining would then attack the Eater. Formation 2, numbering 5 aircraft, were piloted by Flight Leader Joe McCarthy, an American serving in the RCAF, P.O.V. Vernon Byers of the RCAF, must be Royal Canadian Air Force, Flight Leader Norman Barlow of the Royal Australian Air Force, P.O. Geoff Rice, and Flight Leader Les Monro of Royal New Zealand Air Force was to attack the Sorp. The third formation was a mobile reserve consisting of aircraft piloted by Flight Sergeant Cyril Anderson, Flight Leader Bill Townsend, Flight Sergeant Ken Brown, Warner Otley, and Louis Burpee, taking off 2 hours after, on the 17th of May, either to bomb the main targets or to attack 3 smaller secondary targets, the Lister, the Enep, and the Demel. 2 crews were unable to make the mission owing to illness. The operations room for the mission was at 5 Group headquarters at St. Vincent's Hall, Grantham, Lincolnshire. The mission codes transmitted in Morse were Goner, meaning bomb dropped, Nigger, meaning the Monet was breached, and Dingy, meaning the Eater was breached. Interestingly enough, the aforementioned word was the name of Gibson's dog, a black Labrador retriever that had been run over and killed on the morning of the attack. Ouch. Dingy was Young's nickname, a reference to the fact that he had twice survived crash landings at sea when he and his crew were rescued from the aircraft's inflatable rubber dinghy. Now, going outbound, the aircraft would use 2 routes, carefully avoiding known concentrations of flak and time to cross the enemy coast simultaneously. The first aircraft, those of Formation 2, headed off for their longer northern route, took off at 21:28 hours on May 16th. McCarthy's bomber group developed a coolant leak and took off in the reserve aircraft 34 minutes late. Formation 1 took off in groups of 3 at 10-minute intervals beginning at 21:39. The reserve formation did not begin taking off until 9 minutes after midnight on the 17th of May. Well, Formation 1 entered the continental Europe between Walcheren and Schouwen, flew over the Netherlands, skirted air bases at Gilseren and Eindhoven, curved around the ROur defenses and turned north to avoid Ham before turning south to head for the Moan River. Formation 2 flew north, cutting over the Villand and crossing to Iselmere before joining the first route near Wessel and then flying south beyond the Moan to the Sorp River. The bombers flew low, about 100 feet at altitude, to avoid radar detection, and Flight Sergeant George Calmer's radio operator on O for Orange looked over through the aerodrome and was astonished to see the pilot was flying towards the target along a forest firebreak below treetop level. Now, the first casualties were suffered soon after reaching the Dutch coast. Formation 2 did not fare well. Munro's aircraft lost its radio to flak and turned back over the Iselmere, while Rice flew too low and struck the sea, losing his bomb in the water. He recovered and returned to base. After the completion of the raid, Gibson sympathized with Rice, telling him how he had nearly lost his bomb to the sea. Barlow and Byers crossed the coast around the island of Texel. Byers was shot down by flak shortly afterwards, crashing into the Wadensee. Barlow's aircraft hit electricity pylons and crashed 5 kilometers east of Rees, near Haldern. The bomb was thrown clear of the crash and was examined intact by Heinz Schweitzer. Only the delayed bomber piloted by the McCarthy survived to cross the Netherlands. Formation 1 lost Estelle's bomber near the German hamlet of Marbeck when his Lancaster hit a high-voltage electrical cable and then crashed into a field. Well, Formation 1 arrived at the Mona Lake, and Gibson's aircraft, G for George, made its first run, followed by Hopgood, M for Mother. Hopgood's aircraft was hit by flak when it made its low-level run and was caught in the blast of its own bomb, crashing shortly afterwards when a wing disintegrated. 3 crew members successfully abandoned the aircraft, but only 2 survived. Subsequently, Gibson flew his aircraft across the dam to draw flak away from Martin's run. Martin, P for Popsy, bombed third. His aircraft was damaged, but made a successful attack. Next, Young, in the A for Apple, made a successful run, and after him, Maltby, in the J for Johnny, when finally the dam was breached. Gibson, with Young accompanying, led Shannon, Maldsey, and Knight to the Eder. Now, the Eder Valley was covered by heavy fog, but the dam was not defended with any aircraft positions, as the difficult topography made the surrounding hills was thought to make an attack virtually impossible. With the approach so difficult for the first aircraft, Shannon's made 6 runs before taking a break. Maldsey, Z for Zebra, then attempted a run, but the bomb struck on top of the dam, and the aircraft was severely damaged by the blast. Shannon made another run and successfully dropped his bomb. The final bomb of the formation from Knight's aircraft, N for Nut, breached the dam. The Sorp Dam was the one least likely to be breached. It was a heavy earthen dam, unlike the 2 concrete and steel gravity dams that were attacked successfully. Due to various problems, only 2 of the Lancasters reached the Sorp Dam. Joe McCarthy and T for Tommy, one of the delayed aircrafts on the second wave, and later Brown, F for Freddy, from the third formation. This attack differed from the previous ones in 2 ways. The upkeep bomb was not spun, and due to the topography of the dam, the approach was made along the length of the dam, not right angles over the reservoir. McCarthy's plane was on its own when it arrived at the Sorp Dam at 15 minutes after midnight. Realized the approach was even more difficult than expected. The flight path led over a church steeple in the village of Langscheid, located at the hill crest overlooking the dam. With only seconds to go before the bomber had to pull up to avoid hitting the hillside at the other end of the dam, the bomber aimer had no time to correct the bomb's height and heading. McCarthy made 9 attempted bombing runs before Johnson was satisfied. The upkeep bomb was dropped on the 10th run. The bomb exploded, but when he turned his Lancaster to assess the damage, it turned out that only a section of the crest of the dam had blown off. The main body of the dam remained. The 3 of the reserve aircraft who had been directed to the Sorp Dam, Burpee, S for Sugar, never arrived, and it was later determined the plane had been shot down while skirting the Gerzen airfield. Brown, F for Freddy, reached the Sorp Dam in the increasing dense fog after 7 runs. Brown conferred with his bomber aimer and dropped incendiary devices on either side of the valley, which ignited a fire, which subsequently lifted the fog enough to drop a direct hit on the 8th run. The bomb cracked and failed to breach the dam. Anderson and the Y for York never arrived after having been delayed by damage to his rear turret in dense fog, which made his attempts to find the target impossible. The remaining 2 bombers were then sent to secondary targets, with Otley and the C for Charlie being shot down en route to the Lister Dam. Townsend in the O for Orange eventually dropped his bomb at the end-tip dam without harming it. Now, there was some evidence that Townsend might have attacked a beaver dam by mistake rather than the Inept Dam. The war diary of a German naval staff reported that the Bever Dam was attacked at nearly the same time as the Sorp Dam. In addition, the Weberland authority responsible for the Bever Dam said they have recovered the remains of a mine. And Paul Kaiser, a 19-year-old soldier on leave at his home close to the dam, reported a bomber making several approaches to the dam and then dropping a bomb that caused a large explosion and a great pillar of flame. In the book, The Dambusters Raid, author John Sweetman suggests Townsend's report of the moons reflecting on the mist and the water consistent with the attack that was heading to the Bever Dam rather than the Enep Dam, given the moon's azimuth and pilot altitude during the bombing raids. Sweetman also points out that the Enep Wezerband Authority was adamant that only a single bomb was dropped near the Enep Dam during the entire war, and that this bomb fell into the woods by the side of the dam, not in the water, as Townsend's report. Finally, members of Townsend's crew independently reported seeing a manor house and attacking an earthen dam, which is consistent with the Bever Dam rather than the Enep Dam, main evidence supporting the hypothesis of an attack. The Enep Dam is Townsend's post-flight report that he attacked the Enep Dam with a heading of 355 degrees magnetic. Assuming that heading is incorrect, all the other evidence points towards an attack on the Bever Dam. Now, Townsend did report difficulty in finding his dam, and in his post-raid report, he complained that the map of the Enep Dam was incorrect. Those darn maps are always wrong.
Silly maps.
The Bever Dam is only about 5 miles southwest of the Enep Dam, and with the early morning fog that filled the valleys, it would be understandable for him to mistake the two reservoirs. Now, on the way back, flying again at treetop level, 2 more Lancasters were lost. The damaged aircraft of Mulsday were struck by flak near Netterden, and Young's A for Apple plane was hit by flak north of Ilmuden and crashed into the North Sea just off the coast of the Netherlands. On the return flight over the Dutch coast, some German flak aimed at the aircraft was aimed so low that their shells were seen to bounce off the sea. 11 bombers began landing at Scrampton at 3:11 hours, with Gibson's returning at 4:15. The last of the survivors, Townsend's bomber, landed at 6:15. It was the last to land because one of its engines had been shut down after passing off the Dutch coast. Air Chief Marshal Harris was among those who came out to greet the last crew to land. Now, Bomber Command wanted a bomb damage assessment as soon as possible, and the CO of 542 Squadron was informed of estimated time of the attacks. A photo reconnaissance Spitfire, piloted by Flying Officer Frank Jerry Frey, took off from the RAF Benson at 7:30 and arrived over the ROur River some hours after first flight. Photos were taken of the breached dams and the huge floods. The pilot later described the experience. When I was about 150 miles from the Monet Dam, I could see the industrial haze over the ROur area and what appeared to be a cloud in the east. On flying closer, I saw that what seemed to be clouds was the sun shining on the floodwaters. I looked into the deep valley, and what seemed to be peaceful was 3 days before was now a wide torrent. The whole valley of the river was inundated with only patches of high ground, the tops of trees and church steeples showing above the flood. I was overcome by the immensity of it. You know, 3 aircrew from Hopgood's aircraft parachuted, but one died later from wounds, and the others were captured. A crewman from Otley's aircraft survived this crash. In total, 53 of the 133 aircrew who participated in the attack were killed, a casualty rate of almost 40%. 13 of those killed were members of the RCAF, and 2 belonged to the RAAF. Of the survivors, 34 were decorated at Buckingham Palace on the 22nd of June, with Gibson awarded the Victoria Cross. There were 5 Distinguished Service Orders, 10 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and 4 bars, 2 Conspicuous Gallantry Medals, and 11 Distinguished Flying Medals, and 1 bar. Initially, German casualty estimates from the flood were 1,294 killed, including 749 French, Belgian, Dutch, and Ukrainian prisoners of war and laborers.
Wow.
Later estimates, put the death toll at the Moan Valley above 1,600, including people who drowned in the flood wave downstream were from the dam. After a public relations tour of North America and time spent working in the Air Ministry in London, writing a book published as Enemy Coast Ahead, Gibson returned to operations and was killed in a mosquito operation in 1944. Following the dam's raid, the 617 Squadron was kept together as a specialist unit. The motto, "After Me the Flood," and a squadron badge was chosen. According to the Brickhill, there were some controversies over the motto, with the original version stating "After Us the Flood" being rejected by the heralds as having inappropriate provenance, having been corrected reportedly by Madame de Pompadour, and having been said by Louis XV as an irresponsible context, the motto having been chosen by King George the 6th, the latter was finally deemed acceptable. The squadron, surprisingly enough, went on to drop issues like the Tall Boy and Grand Slam bombs when they attacked the German battleship Tirpitz, using the advanced bomb sight, and enabled the bombing of small targets with far greater accuracy than conventional bomb aiming techniques. Now, interesting footnote, in 1977, Article 56 of the Protocol 1 Amendment to the Geneva Convention outlawed attacks on dams if such an attack may cause the release of dangerous forces from the works or installations and consequent severe losses among civilian populations. There is, however, an exception if it is used for other than its normal function and in regular, significant, direct support of military operations, and if such attack is the only feasible way to terminate such support. And sadly, the last surviving member of 617 Squadron, aka Dambusters, responsible for the operation, Johnny Johnson, passed away in 2022.
Aw, not long ago.
Yep. Now, the overall picture, interestingly enough, how the bombing affected the dam breach, from what they were looking at as far as the charts go, 2 dams were completely knocked out. The Monet and the Edersee were breached, flooding their valleys. The Sorp Dam took minor damage. 2 hydroelectric power stations were destroyed and several more damaged. Factories and mines were also damaged and destroyed. And the 1,600, 600 Germans and 1,000 enslaved laborers, mostly Soviet, were killed in the flooding. And despite the rapid repairs by the Germans, productions in these areas did not return to normal until September. So with the bombing raid that they did, they basically took those stations out for 4 months worth of work. They weren't able to do things like ball bearing plants, aircraft factories, tank production, and of course hydroelectric means that there was no power into that area. But it was a little footnote, happened 80 years ago on this night. So that's been the bearded historian, Joe, for the Bud Files. Sue's manning the camera. You folks have a good morning.
Not morning.
It'll be
Afternoon.
It'll be afternoon.
I know.
It is now morning for us.